The exact moment I realized my own children no longer saw me as a real person. I was sitting at a Thanksgiving dinner table, holding a bowl of mashed potatoes that nobody had even bothered to ask for. The entire room was buzzing with laughter and conversation, voices bouncing back and forth from one end of the table to the other. But not a single soul looked my way. When I quietly stood up, put on my winter coat, and walked out the front door, nobody tried to stop me. In fact, nobody even noticed I was gone. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just leaving Thanksgiving dinner, I was walking out of their lives for good. If you've ever felt completely invisible to the people you love most, you know exactly how this feels. Before I share the rest of this story, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Sometimes, just knowing we aren't alone in this world is a huge comfort. 5 years before that Thanksgiving dinner, my husband, David, passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio. To this day, I can still hear the long, hollow flat line of the hospital monitor. Sometimes I still wake up in the early morning, half expecting to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway. After 43 years of marriage, losing him felt like someone had physically torn away half of my heartbeat. David was the absolute center of our family. Not because he was demanding, but because people were just naturally drawn to him. He was the kind of man who would fix the neighborhood kids' broken bikes and spend his entire Saturday helping a complete stranger move furniture. When he laughed, everyone laughed with him. When he hugged you, you felt completely safe. So when he passed, something fundamental shifted within our family. At first, I thought it was just the grief. Everyone processes loss differently. My daughter, Jennifer, buried herself in her work. She lived in a massive house just outside Cincinnati with her husband, Brian, and their 2 daughters. My son, Michael, became distant almost overnight. He stopped calling regularly, stopped visiting, and stopped asking how I was holding up. For a long time, I made excuses for them. They're hurting too, I told myself, just give them time. But time didn't heal what was happening. Time only exposed it. The first Thanksgiving without David felt strange, but we managed. The second one felt lonely. By the third year, I started to notice that the entire family gathering revolved around everyone except me. When I walked near a conversation, it would suddenly drift off. Decisions were made without ever asking for my input. I began to feel less like a mother and more like an elderly relative they brought along out of sheer obligation. Even so, I refused to give up. Family meant everything to me. It always had. Every single Thanksgiving morning, I kept the traditions David and I had built over 4 decades alive. I would wake up before sunrise, brew a pot of coffee, put on the old jazz records we loved, and start preparing the family recipes passed down through generations. The sweet potato casserole, the cornbread stuffing, the green bean casserole, the pumpkin pie, and David's favorite mashed potatoes. The recipe card for those potatoes still has his handwriting on it. Every year I would trace the ink, and for a moment, it felt like he was right there with me. This year started exactly the same way. I was awake by 5:30. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It's the kind of silence that constantly reminds you that you live alone now. As the coffee brewed, I stood by the kitchen window, watching the snow fall lightly onto the backyard grass. For a brief second, I imagined David standing next to me, smiling and teasing me about stressing over nothing. Everything's going to be just fine, Renee, he'd say. That was his favorite line. Everything's going to be just fine. I wished more than anything that I could still believe him. By noon, the kitchen smelled incredible. The counters were packed with dishes. I had spent nearly 2 full days preparing this food for my family. Even though Jennifer had insisted over the phone that she was hosting this year, and even though nobody had asked me to bring a single thing, I did it anyway. Because that's what mothers do. We show love through giving, through sacrificing, through the million little things that usually go unnoticed until they're gone. Around 1 in the afternoon, Jennifer called. The entire conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Hey, Mom! Hey, sweetheart! Just making sure you're still coming over? Of course! Okay, well, we're really busy on this end. See you soon. Click. That was it. No asking how I was doing, no excitement, no warmth. It felt like she was just crossing an item off her to-do list. After the line went dead, I just stared at my phone. The silence in the kitchen suddenly felt very heavy. Years ago, Jennifer would call me 3 times while making Thanksgiving dinner, asking questions, laughing, and sharing stories. Now, I felt like a cold obligation squeezed between her errands. I pushed the thought away. I didn't want to let a bad mood ruin the holiday. At 3 o'clock, I packed everything into my SUV. The pumpkin pie, the casseroles, the containers of homemade cranberry sauce, the serving trays, enough food for 15 people. As I carefully arranged the dishes in the trunk, a strange realization hit me. I couldn't remember the last time Michael had visited me just to catch up. The thought cut deeper than I expected. Every single one of his recent visits involved paperwork, questions about my finances, questions about the house, or questions about his father's old investment portfolio. There were never any questions about me, never how is your health, are you happy, or are you lonely? It was always strictly business. Sitting in the driver's seat, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe grief was making me overly sensitive. Maybe. But deep down, I knew something had gone completely wrong. The 1-hour drive to Jennifer's house in Cincinnati gave me plenty of time to think. Christmas mornings, birthdays, family vacations, soccer games, graduations. I had spent my entire adult life putting my children first. David and I worked multiple jobs just to send them to good schools. We skipped vacations so they could have better opportunities. We sacrificed things they would never even know about. And I would have done it all over again in a heartbeat, because that's what parents do. The problem was, somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing those sacrifices. They stopped seeing me. When I finally pulled into Jennifer's wide driveway, there were already a dozen cars parked outside. The entire house was glowing with warm holiday lights. Laughter drifted through the air. For a moment, hope returned to my heart. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe I was just imagining problems that weren't there. Maybe we would share stories about David, laugh together, and feel like a family again. I grabbed the first heavy casserole dish and walked up to the front door. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt a familiar chill. Nobody came to open the door. Nobody came out to welcome me. It was like no one even knew I had arrived. Through the window, I could see everyone gathered inside, talking, laughing, and celebrating. Yet somehow, despite being invited, I suddenly felt like a stranger standing on the outside of my own family's life. I forced a smile and reached for the doorknob. At that exact moment, I had no idea that before the night was over, I would discover a secret that would completely shatter everything I thought I knew about my children. And I certainly never expected that this Thanksgiving dinner would be the last time I ever sat at their table. I stood on Jennifer's front porch for a few long seconds before pushing the door open myself. The loud burst of laughter immediately flooded out into the cold November air. For a moment, absolutely nobody noticed me. The living room was packed with relatives, neighbors, and friends. The NFL game was playing on the TV, kids were running down the hallway, and someone was carrying a tray of drinks. The house looked incredibly warm and welcoming to everyone inside. Except me. I walked in, holding the heavy casserole dish. "Happy Thanksgiving, everyone!" I called out. A few people glanced my way, then immediately went right back to their conversations. There were no hugs, no excitement, and nobody saying how glad they were that I made it. Just a few polite nods. I kept the forced smile on my face. Maybe everyone was just distracted. Maybe I was overthinking again. That's when Jennifer finally came out of the kitchen. "Oh, hey, Mom." She gave me a quick, hurried kiss on the cheek. It felt more like an administrative duty than actual affection. "Do you need help with those?" she asked. Before I could even answer, she had already turned around. "We're running so far behind schedule," she said, disappearing right back into the kitchen. I stood there completely alone, holding the casserole. For a second, I felt utterly ridiculous, like a delivery driver who had brought food to the wrong house. Eventually, I carried the dish into the kitchen myself. The counters were overflowing with food. I carefully placed my homemade casserole next to a few store-bought deli trays. Nobody commented on it, nobody asked what I brought, and nobody said thank you. I looked around the room. My son-in-law Brian was standing by the refrigerator talking to Michael. The second they noticed me looking their way, both men went completely silent. It was too quiet. An awkward, tense silence stretched between them. Then Michael forced a quick smile. "Hey, Mom!" "Hey, sweetheart." "Happy Thanksgiving." "You too." That was the entire conversation. Within seconds, he turned right back to Brian and started talking again. Only this time, they lowered their voices. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. It wasn't caused by any single moment, but rather the heavy weight of 100 tiny moments just like it. All these little reminders telling me that I was no longer a part of their world. I wandered back out to the living room. My oldest granddaughter, Ashley, was scrolling on her phone and barely looked up. "Hey, Grandma." "Hey, Ashley. That's a beautiful sweater." "Thanks." She immediately dropped her eyes right back to her screen. End of conversation. Only my youngest granddaughter, Emma, seemed genuinely happy to see me. She jumped off the couch and wrapped her arms around me. "Grandma Renee!" Her smile instantly warmed my heart. "There's my favorite girl," I said. "You always say that because it's true," she giggled. We chatted for a few minutes about school and her art classes. It was the first genuine conversation I had experienced all afternoon. But then, Jennifer called Emma into the kitchen, and I was left standing by myself once again. As more guests arrived, the house grew louder. People gathered in small groups, sharing jokes and drinking wine. I wandered between the rooms, searching for a place where I could fit in, a spot where I mattered, a place where I wasn't just taking up space. Finally, dinner was announced. Everyone started moving toward the dining room, and I followed at the back of the line. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then I looked at the table, and my heart dropped. To accommodate 12 people, the dining table had been extended to its full length. Every single chair was occupied. Every seat had been carefully assigned, except there was one thing missing. My seat. For nearly 20 years I had sat in the exact same spot at Thanksgiving dinner, the chair right next to David. After he passed, Jennifer had kept me in that same seat. It had become a tradition, a symbol, a way to remember him. But this year, that seat belonged to someone else. One of Brian's business partners was sitting there, laughing and talking with another guest. I froze in place. Maybe there was another chair? Maybe they had rearranged the layout? That's when Jennifer noticed me. "Oh, Mom," she said, pointing toward a small folding table tucked near the kitchen doorway. "We set up a few extra seats right over there. Over there." Those two words hit harder than she could have ever realized. Sitting at that small folding table were two young children and an elderly neighbor. It wasn't even in the dining room. It was practically in the kitchen. Close enough to hear the family laughing, but far enough away to ensure I wasn't a part of it. I stared at the chair, then looked back at Jennifer. For a split second, I thought she would realize how hurtful this was. But she didn't. She just smiled and turned back to organizing the serving platters. I quietly walked over and sat down. Nobody protested. Nobody offered me their seat at the main table. It seemed like nobody even noticed. From where I sat, I could see everyone enjoying the evening together. Michael was sitting next to Jennifer, Brian was telling a story, and the guests were listening intently. Meanwhile, I was eating dinner with people I barely knew. A deep sense of humiliation took root in my chest. It wasn't about the folding chair itself. It was about what that chair represented. I had spent decades building this family, creating these traditions, and making sure every holiday felt magical for everyone else. And now, there wasn't even a proper place for me at the table. Halfway through dinner, I realized I needed a glass of water. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. As I approached the hallway, I heard voices coming from Brian's home office. The door wasn't fully closed. I instantly recognized Michael's voice. "Once we sell the house, everything will get a lot easier." I froze. "Sell the house?" Brian responded. "I know, but timing is everything. We've waited long enough." Michael sounded frustrated. "It's not like Mom needs all that space anyway." My heart began to race. They were talking about a house. But whose house? Jennifer suddenly turned the corner, and the office door immediately clicked shut. The conversation ended instantly. A few seconds later, Brian and Michael walked out, acting completely normal. Way too normal. Brian smiled and asked, "Everything okay, Renee?" "Renee, not Mom." Not even Mrs. Matthews, just Renee. Like I was a distant acquaintance. "Fine," I said quietly. Michael completely avoided eye contact with me. The knot in my stomach tightened. Something was wrong. I knew something was terribly wrong. The rest of dinner passed by in a complete blur. I found myself watching everyone much closer, listening intently for any clues. Every time I walked near a group, the topic of conversation seemed to shift. Every time I entered a room, certain discussions abruptly vanished. At first, I tried to convince myself I was just imagining things, but then it happened again and again. By the time dessert was served, I felt less like a member of the family and more like an outsider who had accidentally crashed a private gathering. Then, I noticed something else. Michael and Brian kept exchanging worried glances. The kind of looks people give each other when they are trying to protect a secret. A dangerous secret. I looked out at the dining room where the walls were covered in family photos. One of them showed David standing next to me 20 years ago. We were both smiling, so proud of the life we built. Back then, this family felt absolutely unbreakable. Now, I wasn't so sure. As the room laughed around me, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't just about grief anymore? What if it wasn't just about them drifting away? What if they were actively hiding something from me? Something massive that involved my home? For the first time all evening, I began to wonder if David had seen all of this coming long before I ever did. By the time the pumpkin pie was served, I felt emotionally exhausted. Not because the dinner itself was physically demanding, but because I had spent the entire evening pretending I wasn't hurt. Pretending I hadn't noticed the missing seat, pretending I hadn't heard Michael and Brian discussing the house, and pretending I didn't feel completely invisible. For years, I was the one who held everyone together. The peacemaker, the organizer, the mother who remembered every single birthday, anniversary, and special milestone. Now, I was sitting quietly near the kitchen, watching everyone else enjoy a holiday I had spent decades helping to create. Jennifer passed the pumpkin pie around the table. The guests raved about the food, and a few people specifically complimented the mashed potatoes. My mashed potatoes. David's favorite recipe. The dish I had spent an hour preparing that morning. Nobody mentioned that I had made them. Nobody even looked in my direction. I lowered my eyes and focused on my coffee. The pain felt embarrassingly childish. I was 68 years old. Why was I still craving my children's validation? Why was I still waiting for them to notice me? Maybe because a mother never stops being a mother, no matter how old her children get. Across the room, Ashley was talking with a few cousins. Emma sat next to her, looking at photos on her phone. For a moment I watched them and remembered what Jennifer was like at their age. At family gatherings, she used to sit right next to me. She told me everything. Her dreams, her fears, the boys she liked, the colleges she wanted to apply to. Back then, I could never have imagined a future where my own daughter would look right past me like a stranger. Yet somehow, that exact future had arrived. A sudden burst of laughter broke my train of thought. Brian was telling another story, and everyone seemed completely captivated. Even Michael was laughing. That's when I noticed another detail. Whenever the conversation drifted toward family history or David, someone almost deliberately changed the subject. It was as if they were actively avoiding the past. Or, more accurately, avoiding something connected to it. The unease in my stomach continued to grow. Right then, something happened that changed everything. Ashley looked up from her phone screen, completely unaware of the tension in the room, and asked a simple question with total innocence. Does Grandma know about the assisted living facility yet? The entire room instantly froze. Every single voice vanished. Forks remained suspended mid-air. Conversations stopped dead. Even the football game on the TV suddenly felt incredibly distant. I could feel my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Ashley looked around, completely confused. What's wrong? Jennifer's face went entirely pale. The coffee cup in Michael's hand nearly slipped. Brian stared fixedly down at the table. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. I looked directly at Jennifer. What assisted living facility? My voice sounded calm, too calm. Jennifer swallowed hard. Ashley instantly realized she had said something wrong, her eyes widening in panic. "It's okay, Jennifer," I repeated. "What assisted living facility?" My daughter forced a tight, nervous laugh. "Mom, it's nothing." "Nothing? That word?" I carefully set my coffee cup down. "That's the favorite word of people hiding something. So, explain it to me." Jennifer glanced at Michael. Michael glanced at Brian. The silent exchange lasted less than a second, but it told me absolutely everything. They had rehearsed this. Maybe not this exact conversation, but the secret itself was something they had planned together long ago. Finally, Jennifer spoke up. "We were just discussing options for the future." "What future? Your future?" I stared at her. "Your future, Mom. You're getting older." There it was. The one phrase every aging parent eventually dreads hearing. "You're getting older." It wasn't "how are you feeling," it wasn't "what do you need," and it wasn't "are you happy." It was just a cold reminder that your age has officially become a logistical problem for someone else. I folded my hands in my lap. "So, what exactly did you discuss?" Jennifer looked deeply uncomfortable. Michael stepped in. "We're just worried about you, Mom." "Worried?" Another interesting word. "What exactly are you worried about?" Nobody answered right away. Finally, Michael said, "You live all by yourself. I've lived by myself for 5 years. You're not young anymore." The room remained dead silent. Every single guest was pretending not to listen, yet every single ear was strained to catch every word. I looked at Michael, then at Jennifer, and then back to Michael. "Did any of you bother to ask me if I wanted to move into an assisted living facility?" No one answered. Because they already knew the answer. "No," I said quietly. "No, you didn't," Jennifer sighed. "Mom, we were just exploring possibilities. We didn't tell you because we didn't want to upset you." The irony almost made me laugh out loud. It wasn't the idea itself that upset me, it was the betrayal. Before I could even respond, Emma suddenly spoke up. "Grandma doesn't need to go to an assisted living home." Jennifer shot her daughter a sharp, harsh look of warning. "Emma, that's enough." Emma went quiet. But I noticed something incredibly important. The sheer panic in Jennifer's expression. It wasn't worry. It was fear. It was as if she was desperately trying to shut this conversation down before something else slipped out. The knot in my stomach tightened even more. Right then, another detail caught my eye. On the buffet counter behind Brian, there was a folder. A plain blue folder, sitting half open. Most people wouldn't have thought twice about it, but I noticed it because I could see the edge of a signature page peeking out. And the handwriting on it looked incredibly familiar. Terribly familiar. It looked like my signature, or at least, an imitation of it. I excused myself from the table and walked toward the counter. Brian stood up instantly. "Do you need something, Renee?" There it was again. "Not Mom, Renee." I pointed at the folder. "What is that?" His reaction was far too fast, way too defensive. "It's nothing important." He reached out to grab the folder, but before he could pull it away, I caught a clear glimpse of the page. A signature. My signature. I stopped breathing for a second. Because I knew something that nobody else in that room realized. I hadn't signed a single legal document in months. Not one. Yet, there my name was, written in blue ink on a document they clearly didn't want me to see. Brian quickly closed the folder. The movement was subtle, but it was enough. It confirmed my growing suspicions. Someone was doing things behind my back. Something involving legal paperwork, something involving property, and perhaps tied directly to that private conversation about selling the house. I walked back to my chair, my heart pounding. The room slowly filled with conversation again, as people tried to pretend everything was back to normal. But nothing would ever be normal again. I watched Jennifer laugh at a guest's joke. I watched Michael avoid looking in my direction. I watched Brian keep that blue folder within arm's reach. For the first time all evening, a terrifying reality sunk in. What if this wasn't just about moving me out of my home? What if this discussion about assisted living was just one piece of a much larger plan? A plan involving my finances, my property, and my future. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces clicked together. The strange conversations, the missing seat, the secrecy, the talk of selling the house, the unexplained legal documents, and that signature, my signature, or rather, a forged version of it. Suddenly, I didn't feel hurt anymore. I felt alert. Incredibly alert. If someone was willing to forge my signature once, what else had they done? And who exactly was driving this? Michael, Brian, Jennifer, or all three of them together? As the dessert plates were cleared and laughter filled the room once more, a profound realization washed over me. I wasn't sitting among family. I was sitting in a room full of people who were keeping a massive, dangerous secret from me. And before this night was over, I intended to find out exactly what it was. I didn't confront anyone that night. Not because I wasn't angry, not because I wasn't deeply hurt, and certainly not because I was afraid. I stayed silent because David's voice echoed in my mind. Renee, when people think you don't know the truth, they'll show you far more than they ever intended to hide. In 43 years of marriage, my husband was rarely wrong about people. In that moment, I decided to trust his advice. I smiled when people looked at me, nodded along during conversations, and even accepted a second piece of pie I didn't want. And through it all, I watched, I listened, and I waited. That blue folder never left Brian's side. That fact alone spoke volumes. Whatever was inside it was absolutely vital to them. Around 9 o'clock, the guests began to pack up and leave. Coats were fetched, tired children were gathered, and the house filled with goodbyes. I should have felt relieved, but instead, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. The kind of clarity that only arrives after something inside you breaks completely. Jennifer stood by the front door thanking her guests. Michael helped carry leftovers into the kitchen. Brian was chatting with a neighbor. Nobody checked on me. Nobody showed the slightest interest in asking how I felt after that tense conversation about my living situation. It was as if that entire dialogue had never happened. As if my future was just a casual topic brought up over dessert. No different than discussing the score of a football game. I stood quietly in the hallway, looking at the family photos on the wall. There was one from Jennifer's wedding, another from Michael's college graduation, and an old Christmas photo from years ago. Then I saw my absolute favorite, a photo of David holding Emma when she was just a baby. His smile was so bright, his eyes filled with pure love. I reached out and touched the frame. God. I missed him more than anyone knew, more than I usually allowed myself to admit. Because if David were here, he would have noticed. If I had been pushed to a folding table, he would have noticed. If our children were ignoring me, he would have noticed. If someone was plotting behind my back, he absolutely would have noticed. Suddenly, I felt entirely alone. Not just because my husband was gone, but because I realized I had been lying to myself for years. Pretending the growing distance between my children and me wasn't real. Pretending every ignored phone call, every forgotten visit, and every cold interaction didn't matter. Tonight stripped away every last illusion. The truth stood bare right in front of me. I was no longer a priority in my children's lives. Perhaps I hadn't been for a very long time. I glanced toward the kitchen. Jennifer was laughing with Brian, and Michael was staring at his phone. Neither of them looked my way, not even once. I quietly walked over to the coat rack, took down my winter coat, and slid it on. Nobody noticed. I picked up my handbag. Still, nobody noticed. For a brief moment, I stood in the middle of the room and waited. Not because I wanted to make a scene, but because a tiny part of me still hoped one of my children would look up. Maybe Jennifer would say, "Mom, you're leaving so early?" Maybe Michael would ask, "Are you okay?" Maybe someone would walk me to my car. Maybe someone would give me a hug. Maybe. But nobody did. The room was still, full of sound, full of laughter, full of people, yet I had never felt so completely invisible. I pushed the front door open and the cold night air rushed in. Still, nobody looked up. I stepped outside, and the door clicked shut softly behind me. That was it. No goodbyes, no farewells, nobody calling out my name. Just absolute silence. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, staring out at the dark driveway. Then I began walking toward my SUV. Every single step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was leaving Thanksgiving dinner, but because I was leaving behind years of holding on to the belief that my family still valued me the way I valued them. When I reached my car, I placed my hand on the door handle and turned back around one last time. The house glowed warmly in the dark night. From the outside, it looked beautiful. A picture-perfect family Thanksgiving. Anyone driving past would see happiness, tradition, and togetherness. They would never guess what was actually happening inside. They would never guess that a mother had just spent the evening feeling like an unwanted guest in the family she helped build. A single tear slipped down my cheek, and I wiped it away immediately. I wasn't crying out of self-pity. I was mourning. Mourning the family I thought I had. Mourning the relationships I spent decades nurturing. And mourning the realization that love isn't always returned. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. Not a single person walked out to see me off, not one. The further I drove, the lighter I felt. Not happier, just clearer. The fog that had clouded my judgment for years had finally vanished. As I pulled onto the interstate, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to go back to my house just yet. Home suddenly felt different. The conversations I had overheard kept looping in my mind. Once we sell the house. Does Grandma know about the assisted living facility yet? The unexplained legal document. The forged signature. None of it made sense right now, but I was fully committed to uncovering the truth. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down at the screen. For a brief second, a tiny flicker of hope flared up inside me. Maybe Jennifer realized I left. Maybe she was worried. Maybe she wanted to apologize. The notification wasn't from Jennifer. It wasn't from Michael either. It was just a promotional email. I offered a bitter smile, kept my eyes on the road, and drove into the dark. Another 20 minutes went by. No calls, no texts, absolutely nothing. They still hadn't noticed I was gone. The realization stung more than I cared to admit. I had been away for nearly half an hour, and not a single soul cared enough to wonder where I was. Not one. Then a memory surfaced. A few months ago, Robert Hayes had called me. He was David's longtime attorney, the man who had handled almost every major legal matter in our lives. During that call, Robert had said something unusual. "If you ever need anything, Renee, call me, day or night." I hadn't thought much of it back then. Now those words rushed back. Day or night. A strange intuition took hold of me. Instead of taking the highway toward my house, I caught the exit toward downtown Columbus. I headed straight for Robert's office. The further I drove, the stronger the feeling grew. David had trusted Robert implicitly. If something untoward was happening, Robert would know exactly where to begin looking. By the time I reached downtown, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Most of the office buildings were dark, and the streets were completely deserted. I pulled up outside a modest brick building and sat in the car for a moment. Part of me felt foolish. The other part felt an absolute certainty. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my handbag and stepped out into the freezing night air. What I didn't know then was that before the night ended, Robert Hayes would hand me something David had left behind years ago. Something that would change everything. Prepared by my husband long before his passing. And once I opened it, there would be no turning back. The lights were still on inside Robert's office, which surprised me. It was Thanksgiving night, close to 10 o'clock. Most people were home with family, but Robert was never quite like most people. For over 30 years, he had been far more than just our lawyer. He was one of David's closest friends. They played golf together, argued over football, and shared countless family dinners. If there was one person David trusted completely, it was Robert. I walked through the front door with a hint of hesitation. The reception desk was empty, and the hallway was lit by a soft, warm glow. Before I could even knock on his office door, it swung open. He looked a little older than the last time I saw him. His hair was completely gray now, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, but the concern on his face was instant. "Rennie." His expression shifted completely. "What happened?" Just the question alone nearly brought me to tears. Not because it was dramatic, but because for the first time all day, someone looked at me and actually cared. I forced a small smile. "Happy Thanksgiving, Robert." He studied my face for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come on in." I followed him into the office, which smelled faintly of coffee and old books. It felt strangely comforting, like stepping back in time. Robert closed the door behind me. "Tell me what's going on." For a few minutes, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't know where to start. Eventually, I told him everything. The missing seat, the conversations that stopped the second I entered the room, the discussion about assisted living, the folder, the signature, and the talk about selling my house. Robert listened quietly, never interrupting. With every detail I shared, his expression grew more serious. By the time I finished, the room had fallen into a heavy silence. He leaned back slowly in his chair. I was always afraid this day would come. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Robert looked toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine sorrow in his eyes. David prepared for this possibility. I stared at him. What possibility? That one day, your children might start looking at you as a source of assets rather than a mother. The words hit like a physical blow. My immediate instinct was to defend Jennifer and Michael, to protect them, but everything that had unfolded tonight made that impossible. Robert stood up, walked over to the filing cabinet, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. My heart skipped a beat. Written across the front in David's familiar handwriting were a few simple words. For Renee's eyes only. Open when necessary. I held my breath. For a second, it felt as if my husband had reached across time to place a hand on my shoulder. I recognized the script instantly. The slant, the neat letters, the exact same handwriting from decades of recipe cards and birthday notes. My fingers trembled as Robert placed the envelope in front of me. He left this with me 3 years before he passed, Robert said. I couldn't take my eyes off it. What is it? Robert sat back down. A contingency plan. A what? He instructed me never to hand this to you unless specific circumstances arose. I looked up. What circumstances? Robert hesitated briefly before answering quietly. If your children ever tried to manipulate you, isolate you, or pressure you regarding the estate and the assets. My chest tightened. David had seen all of this coming years before his death. The thought seemed unbelievable, yet the evidence was sitting right in front of me. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several legal documents, and a thumb drive. The letter was on top. I unfolded the paper. As soon as I saw the first line, my eyes welled with tears. My dearest Renee, if you are reading this, it means the things I hoped would never happen have come to pass. I had to pause for a moment. David's voice felt so alive in every single word. Robert quietly turned his chair away. Giving me a moment of privacy, I kept reading. You know better than anyone how much I love our children. Everything I did in life was for you and for them. But love shouldn't blind us to reality. Over the last few years, I noticed changes. Small changes. Conversations about money, inquiries about property ownership, questions about the inheritance. Asked far more often than inquiries about your well-being. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed this letter would never be opened, but if it has been, I need you to know one important thing. None of this is your fault. A tear dropped onto the page. I kept going. You always believe the best in people. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But it can also make you vulnerable to those who mistake your kindness for weakness. If anyone ever pressures you regarding the house, the finances, or your future arrangements, do not give in out of guilt. Protect yourself. Protect your peace of mind. Protect the life we built together. My hands were shaking violently now. Every word felt as if David were sitting right next to me, speaking directly to my heart. The next paragraph changed everything. Most importantly, there are aspects of our estate that only Robert fully understands. I intentionally established certain protective legal safeguards, trust structures, to ensure nobody can force you into a decision that isn't in your best interest. Trust Robert. Trust the legal documents attached. And above all, trust yourself. You are far stronger than you realize. Love always, David. By the time I reached his signature, I was crying silently. It wasn't hysterical, just steady, quiet tears, the kind that fall when grief and love collide all at once. Robert handed me a tissue, and neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, I looked down at the legal documents beneath the letter. What are these? Robert let out a slow breath. The safeguards David mentioned. I wiped my eyes. What kind of safeguards? He opened a folder, and the sudden gravity in his tone commanded my attention. Before David passed, he restructured how a portion of your joint assets are held. I frowned. Our assets? Yes, Robert said, pointing to the text. He wanted to ensure that no asset transfers could ever be forced through without your direct authorization and multiple layers of independent legal review. A strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It felt more like an awakening. For years, I had assumed David's estate planning was perfectly straightforward. Clearly, it wasn't. Clearly, he had anticipated risks I had never even considered. Why would he go to such lengths? Robert looked straight at me. Because he saw the warning signs. What warning signs? He paused, choosing his words carefully. A few years back, Michael began asking very detailed, unusual questions about the property deeds, and there were some concerns regarding Brian. I stared at him. Michael? Robert nodded. The air in the office suddenly felt cold. Brian's concerns. Financial concerns. I remembered Brian's nervous behavior back at Thanksgiving dinner, the folder, the secrets, the endless whispering. Suddenly, everything began to connect. The picture wasn't complete yet, but it was chilling. I leaned back, trying to absorb the weight of it all. The Thanksgiving dinner, the talk of assisted living, the suspicious signature, David's letter, the safeguards, the warnings, all of it. Then, a terrible thought struck me. What if they've already set things in motion? Robert's expression darkened. That is exactly what we need to find out. For the first time all evening, I realized this was no longer just a family disagreement. This was something much larger. It involved potential fraud, legal forgery, and the exact situation David had tried to shield me from years ago. As Robert reached for another file on his desk, I had a sinking feeling that the worst truths were still ahead. After Robert finished speaking, neither of us said a word for several minutes. The office was incredibly quiet. Outside, Thanksgiving night carried on as usual across the country. Families were gathered around fireplaces, children were playing with their cousins, and people were eating leftovers while watching football. Meanwhile, I was sitting across from my lawyer, wondering if my own children were actively plotting against me. It felt completely surreal. A part of me still desperately wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding, a logical mistake, an error. But another part remembered the look on Jennifer's face when Ashley mentioned the assisted living facility. The panic, the fear, the guilt. That wasn't the reaction of someone innocent. Robert finally broke the silence. What do you want to do tonight, Renee? I looked down at David's letter. I don't know. Do you feel safe going home? The question caught me off guard. Safe? As your attorney, I have to ask. I thought about it. To be honest, I didn't fear any physical danger. My children wouldn't harm me. But emotionally, that was a completely different story. I'm not sure, I admitted. Robert gave a slow nod. As a precaution, I recommend you don't go back there tonight until we have more information. The seriousness in his voice was unsettling. Before I could reply, my phone suddenly vibrated on the desk. I glanced at the screen. It was Jennifer. My stomach tightened. The phone kept ringing. For a fleeting second, I considered picking it up. Then I noticed the time. It was 11:17 p.m. I had been gone for nearly 2 hours. 2 hours. And only now had she finally noticed. I silenced the ringer. A few seconds later, another call flashed on the screen. Michael. Then another from Jennifer. Robert watched quietly. They finally realized you're missing. I stared at the screen. a bitter sadness settling deep in my chest. It wasn't because they were calling. It was because it had taken them so long to care. I could picture the exact scene playing out at Jennifer's house. The guests leaving, dishes being cleared, conversations winding down, and finally, someone asking, "Where's Mom?" Followed by the sudden realization that I had vanished into thin air. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Jennifer. "Mom, where are you?" Immediately followed by another. "Please call me back." Then came one from Michael. "We need to talk, need not, want." The distinction wasn't lost on me. Over the years, I had watched my son become incredibly selective with his communication. When he needed something, he called. When he didn't, weeks would pass without a word. Tonight seemed no different, except the stakes were much higher. I flipped the phone face down on the desk. Robert remained silent, knowing he didn't need to say out loud what we were both thinking. The timing alone spoke volumes. Another message arrived, and then another. The phone buzzed continuously. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened Jennifer's latest text. "Mom," answer the phone. "We're worried?" The word felt entirely foreign. Were they worried when they discussed putting me away without my knowledge? Were they worried when they hid the paperwork? Were they worried when they banished me to a folding table? I wasn't so sure. A new message appeared this time from Brian. "Rennie, please call us back." Immediately I narrowed my eyes. Not Mom. Renee. Even in the middle of a crisis, he couldn't bring himself to address me as family. Robert noticed the shift in my expression. "What is it?" I handed him the phone. He read the message and slowly handed it back. Interesting choice of words. That's one way to put it. The phone rang again, and this time, Michael left a voicemail. A minute later, a second one arrived, followed by a third. The urgency was escalating rapidly. I played the first message. "Hey, Mom, give me a call when you get this." His voice sounded calm, almost casual. The second voicemail arrived 20 minutes later, and the difference was stark. "Mom, seriously, please call us back." The third one sounded completely different. There was tension now, frustration, and perhaps a hint of fear. "Mom, where are you? We have to talk tonight." There it was again, have to talk. It was always about what they needed, never an "I love you," never a "we miss you," never a "are you okay?" Robert crossed his hands. "Do you notice the progression?" I nodded. "They sound frantic." "Exactly." A chill ran through me. Something about their reaction felt wrong. If they were simply worried about my safety, the messages would sound different. Instead, they sounded increasingly desperate, as if something crucial depended entirely on locating me, and it had to happen fast. My phone rang again. "Brian," I ignored it. Immediately after, a text flashed across the screen. "The paperwork needs to be discussed." I froze. The paperwork. There it was. The one word none of them wanted to say out loud. I showed it to Robert, and his jaw tightened. That was incredibly sloppy of him. I stared at the screen. Paperwork. Not "are you safe?" Not "we're worried." Not "we love you." Paperwork. The message only existed for a few seconds before Brian deleted it, but I had already read it. And more importantly, I had already taken a screenshot. Robert actually smiled. "Good. Do you think it's important?" "Extremely." For the first time all night, I saw a look of absolute certainty in his eyes. Whatever was going on, the pieces were beginning to surface. The masks were slipping. Meanwhile, my family seemed to be coming apart at the seams. Shortly after midnight, another call came in. But this time it was Emma. I answered immediately. Hi, sweetie. Grandma! Her voice sounded frightened. Oh, thank goodness. My heart melted instantly. Unlike the others, Emma sounded genuinely terrified for me. It wasn't anxiety or desperation. It was pure care. Are you okay? She asked. I'm perfectly fine. Everyone is looking for you. I hesitated. Everyone. She lowered her voice to a whisper. Uncle Michael and Mom are arguing. I frowned. About what? I'm not entirely sure. A brief pause followed. Then she whispered, Actually, I think I do know. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? They keep talking about a signature. I looked over at Robert, whose expression immediately turned grim. Signatures and paperwork. A cold feeling settled deep in my chest. Emma continued. I wasn't supposed to hear them. What else did they say? Another pause. Then, Uncle Michael said, if they don't find you sincere, the deal's going to fall through. A deal. Not family, not concern. A deal. I closed my eyes. The words hit harder than I expected because deep down I already knew what it meant. The calls, the panic, the sudden urgency. None of it was about me. It was about something they needed from me, something they thought they already had under control. And now that I was gone, their entire plan was suddenly in jeopardy. Emma's voice trembled. Grandma, I'm here. Are you ever coming back? I swallowed hard. The question carried far more weight than she could possibly realize. For the first time in my life, I honestly didn't know the answer. Go back to Jennifer's house? Back to the role I had always played? Back to sacrificing everything only to receive less and less in return? I don't know just yet, sweetie. She went quiet, then said something that nearly broke my heart. I miss you already. Tears filled my eyes. After hours of manipulation, lies, and suspicion, that single honest sentence felt incredibly heavy. I love you too, Emma. I love you too. After the call ended, silence returned to the room. Robert leaned back in his chair, and neither of us spoke for a long while. Finally, he said, They aren't looking for you because you left. I stared at David's letter resting on the desk. No, I know that now. Robert nodded slowly. They're looking for you because without you, whatever they planned cannot be completed. As my phone continued to vibrate with missed calls from Jennifer, Michael, and Brian, I accepted a painful truth. For the first time in my life, my absence held value to them. Not because they missed me, but because they needed something only I could provide. And whatever that was, I began to suspect it involved far more than just a house. I didn't go home that night. On Robert's advice, I checked into a small hotel near downtown Columbus. Not because I was hiding, but because I needed time to think, time to process everything that had happened in less than 24 hours. The ignored Thanksgiving dinner, the discussion about assisted living, the suspicious documents, David's letter, the desperate barrage of phone calls, and Emma's revelation about a deal that couldn't close without me. Sleep was brief and restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's handwriting. Protect yourself. Protect your peace of mind. Protect the life we built together. The next morning at 6:30 a.m., I was sitting across from Robert once again. The long holiday weekend was just beginning, but neither of us wanted to wait any longer. Things were moving, and we both knew it. Robert walked in carrying several folders, a grim expression on his face. The kind a lawyer wears when preparing to deliver bad news. Did you sleep at all? Not much. I figured. He sat down and opened one of the folders. I want to introduce you to someone. Before I could ask who, the office door opened, and a tall man in his early 50s stepped inside. He had short brown hair, a calm gaze, and a professional demeanor. The kind of person who takes in everything around him the moment he enters a room. "Renee, this is Daniel Brooks." The man extended his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Matthews." I shook it. "Likewise." Robert pointed to a chair. "Daniel is a private investigator." That caught my attention immediately. I looked from Daniel to Robert, then back to Daniel. "A private investigator?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am." My stomach tightened. I wasn't sure I liked where this conversation was heading. Robert crossed his arms. "A few months back before Thanksgiving, you contacted me with some concerns." I frowned. I remember. At the time, my worries had felt vague and difficult to explain. Little things, uncomfortable feelings, strange comments from Michael, questions about property ownership, things that seemed increasingly focused on assets rather than family. Nothing concrete, just instinct. Based on those concerns, Robert continued, I recommended bringing Daniel in. My eyes widened as I remembered the phone call, the meeting, the conversation I had nearly put out of my mind. Back in August, I had quietly agreed to let Daniel look into a few matters. At the time, I felt guilty, even a bit paranoid. I had almost cancelled the arrangement twice. Now, I was profoundly grateful I hadn't. Daniel opened a folder. What I'm about to show you isn't pleasant. The room suddenly felt cold. I'd rather know the truth, I said firmly. He nodded. That's usually the right choice. The first document was slid across the desk. A printed email. I recognized Michael's name instantly. My heart quickened. What is this? Daniel pointed to the screenshots attached to the report. These are communication logs obtained through public records, business disclosures, and other legal investigative methods. I began to read. Halfway down the first page, my heart sank to the floor. The exchange was between Michael and Brian, and the subject line read, My house, not their house. My house. It was right there in black and white, estimated market values, potential sale prices, and projected proceeds. I looked up, momentarily speechless. Daniel continued calmly. These conversations began roughly 8 months ago. 8 months. I stared at him. 8 months. Yes, ma'am. The realization hit heavily. While I was still calling my children, sending birthday cards, and inviting them over for dinner, they had been discussing my property for months. Daniel slid another document toward me. This one contained messages between Brian and an unnamed real estate consultant. The phrasing made my skin crawl. Once Renee transitions to assisted living, the process will be much smoother transitions. Not moves, not chooses. Transitions. As if my life were a logistical hurdle, an item of inventory. I pushed the paperwork away, my hands shaking. Daniel gave me a moment before continuing. There's more. Of course there was. There always was. The next file showed records of multiple meetings involving Michael, Brian, a financial advisor, and a real estate specialist. Several conversations focused on timing, strategy, and document preparation. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Asset control. I felt physically sick and Robert noticed immediately. You don't have to keep reading, Renee. No, I said firmly. I need to. If my family had been planning this, I needed to see the full picture, no matter how painful. Daniel gave a respectful nod and opened another folder. This time, the contents were different. Photos, surveillance photographs, and public records. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but together they told a story. a story unfolding entirely behind my back. One image showed Michael and Brian meeting outside a title company. Another showed the two entering a law office. A third showed them speaking with a real estate agent. The dates went back nearly a year. Nearly a year. I couldn't stop thinking about it. While I was still grieving the Museos, David adjusting to living alone and trying to keep family traditions alive, they had been actively formulating a long-term plan. Daniel set the photos aside and looked directly at me. Mrs. Matthews, I need to ask you something. Have you signed any documents transferring ownership of your home? No. Any power of attorney forms? No. Genten Weyrenbjauger, any authorization forms? None. Daniel nodded. To the best of our knowledge, that is accurate. The phrasing caught my attention. To the best of our knowledge, not a simple yes. There was more to it. Robert and Daniel exchanged a glance that I caught instantly. My stomach tightened again. What is it? Daniel hesitated briefly before sliding the final document across the desk. I looked down, and it felt as if all the air had been pulled from my lungs. It was a copy of a signature page. My name appeared at the bottom. Rennie Matthews. The signature looked incredibly authentic, almost perfect. Almost, but not quite. Because I knew my own handwriting, and I had never signed that page. I stared at it, unable to speak, unable to breathe, unable to fully process what I was seeing. Daniel finally broke the silence. We believe this signature may be a forgery. The room went completely still. A forged signature, not a misunderstanding, not a guess, not hurt feelings. A forged signature, a potential crime at the state or federal level. I closed my eyes. A part of me wanted to deny it, to insist there had to be some other explanation. But I remembered the folder from Thanksgiving. I remembered the way Brian hid it away. I remembered the panic, the secrets, the whispers, the fear. Everything suddenly made sense. Far more sense than it had before. What document is this attached to? Daniel answered immediately. A preliminary deed authorization related to a real estate transaction. My pulse raced. A real estate transaction? Yes, ma'am. Robert leaned forward. That is why your absence last night caused such a panic. I looked at him. What do you mean? Because if the transaction is to move forward, additional signatures will ultimately be required to finalize the transfer. All the pieces finally fit together. The frantic calls, the desperate messages, the urgency. It was never about Thanksgiving. It was never about family. It was never about me. It was about the transaction, the timeline, the plan. And now, I was suddenly no longer playing along. Daniel closed the file. There's one last thing. I braced myself. What is it? His expression grew even graver. The investigation suggests Michael wasn't acting alone. Before he even spoke, I already knew the answer. Brian, Daniel said, nodding. In our assessment, Brian appears to be the primary driving force. The room fell entirely silent. I thought back to Thanksgiving. The missing chair, the false concern, the hidden folder, the constant whispering. Brian was at the center of it all, and for the first time, a new emotion emerged. Not sadness, not grief. Anger, a cold, clear, entirely justified anger, because whatever mistakes my children had made, someone had guided them down this path. Someone had convinced them to see me as an obstacle rather than a mother. As I stared at the signature page where my name had been forged, I realized something important. The woman who walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner was no longer the woman sitting in Robert's office today. The old Renee would have questioned herself. The current Renee demanded answers. And she intended to unearth every single one of them. For most of my life, I truly believed that being informed brought a sense of comfort. I believed that as long as you understood the truth, you could handle it. But that weekend, I learned a completely different lesson. Sometimes, the truth cuts deep before it ever heals you, relentlessly shattering the beautiful illusions you were so desperate to hold on to. The forged signature sat on the desk between Robert and me, just a common piece of paper, yet it carried an immense, crushing weight. It wasn't just deception, it was the ultimate betrayal. A stranger had never done something like this to me. My own flesh and blood, my own family, had actually done this. I stared at that document for a long time, trying to connect it to the children I had raised. The little boy who used to pick dandelions from the yard to hand to me. The little girl who would crawl into my bed after a nightmare. How did we ever get to this point? How did property become more important than trust? Ultimately, I pushed the question aside. There would be plenty of time to grieve later. Right now, I needed the facts. Robert seemed to sense the shift in my mindset. Good, he said. I looked up. What? The way you're sitting? I frowned. What do you mean? You're no longer reacting out of pure emotion. I glanced at the folders scattered across the conference table and realized he was right. For the first 24 hours, all I felt was pure shock. Now a different sensation was taking over. Absolute clarity. It was the exact kind of clear-headedness David always showed whenever we faced a crisis. Tell me everything, I said. Robert clasped his hands, gave a firm nod, and opened another file. Let's start with ownership. Ownership. The word suddenly carried massive weight. Tachotulajifan Winjen. The property records, the trust agreements, the investment summaries, and the deeds. These were documents I had either forgotten existed or had never fully understood. David always handled the complex financial side of things. Not because I wasn't capable, but because we had a clear division of labor. He managed the investments, and I managed our daily life. The setup had worked perfectly for decades. Clearly, he had also planned far into the future. Robert pointed to the first page. Your current family home. I instantly recognized the address. It was the house David and I had lived in for 36 years. The place where we raised Jennifer and Michael. The house that everyone suddenly seemed deeply interested in. What about it? Robert slid the deed toward me. Whose name is on this? I looked closely, then looked again, my eyes widening. Only one name appeared on the document. Renee Matthews, not David. Not David's estate trust. Not Michael. Not Jennifer. Just me. It belonged completely and exclusively to me. Wait, I said, looking up. I thought David and I owned it jointly. You did initially. Robert nodded. But a few years before he passed, David transferred the full sole ownership of the house directly into your name. I blinked. I don't remember doing that. You signed the paperwork. I searched my memory and slowly recalled the meeting. A stack of papers, a conversation about estate planning. At the time, I hadn't paid close attention because I trusted David implicitly. Clearly, I should have listened much closer. Robert tapped the page. This house belongs entirely to you. A strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't just relief. It was a profound sense of empowerment. For the first time, I understood exactly why certain people had suddenly become so interested in my future. I wasn't just an aging widow. I was the sole legal owner of a highly valuable piece of real estate, and they knew it. Robert opened another folder. There's more. There was always more. He showed me documents related to a small lakefront property, and my eyes widened again. The cabin. Robert smiled faintly. You remember it? Vaguely. Years ago, David had bought a small cabin a few hours away. We used to go there occasionally for weekends to fish, read, and escape the city. After he passed, I had practically forgotten it existed. The cabin is yours too. I shook my head slowly. Entirely in my name? My mind instantly flashed back to Thanksgiving night, to the conversation I had overheard. Once we sell the house? Which house? Now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe they wanted all of it. The family home, the cabin, anything they could get their hands on. Robert continued. Then there are the investment accounts. My stomach tightened. Money had never interested me much. Security interested me. Independence interested me, but numbers on a statement rarely excited me. Today felt different. Today, those numbers represented absolute freedom. Freedom from manipulation. Freedom from pressure. Freedom from the control of people who viewed me as nothing more than a transaction. Robert handed me another summary, and the balance was substantially larger than I ever expected. Much larger. I stared at it. David never told me. He didn't want you worrying about finances. That was exactly like David. Protective to a fault. Quietly carrying the heavy lifting, always making life easier for everyone else, even after he was gone. Robert pointed to several legal clauses. These assets are fully protected by the trust structures David set up years ago. I studied the documents. Most of the language was dense, but one detail stood out immediately. It required multiple approvals, extra reviews, protective restrictions, and legal barriers. David hadn't just organized our finances, he had built a fortress around them. A fortress designed specifically to protect me. The realization brought tears to my eyes. Even now, years after his passing, he was still taking care of me. Robert gave me a moment before continuing. The most important takeaway is this. I looked up. Absolutely nobody can legally force you to transfer any of these assets. The statement felt incredibly powerful. Absolutely nobody. Not Michael, not Jennifer, not Brian. Nobody. For months, maybe years. I had unconsciously acted as though my children held some kind of authority over my life. Now, I saw the truth. They didn't. The only authority they had was the power I chose to give them, and that realization changed something fundamental inside me. Daniel stepped back into the room holding additional paperwork. Sorry to interrupt. He placed another folder on the desk. What's that? More information on Brian. The atmosphere shifted instantly, because even before opening the folder, I already suspected what we would find. Debt. The answers appeared right on the very first page. Massive debts, credit card balances, business losses, personal loans, and overdue payments. I stared in disbelief. The numbers were staggering, far worse than anything I could have imagined. Daniel spoke carefully. We believe these severe financial pressures likely explain a significant portion of his actions. Explain his actions, not excuse them, but explain them. There was a major difference between the two. I studied the report, and suddenly, every single piece of the puzzle locked into place. The urgency, the secrecy, the meetings, the pressure, and the discussions about the property. A desperate man facing a severe financial crisis could easily convince himself that almost anything was justified, even exploiting his own family, especially if the potential payout seemed lucrative enough. Robert crossed his arms. Do you see now why they panicked so completely when you disappeared? I nodded slowly. For the first time, I truly understood. My absence wasn't an emotional problem for them. It was a logistical nightmare. Their plan relied on access. Access relied on my cooperation. Cooperation relied on me, and I was no longer playing along. I thought about all the phone calls, all the text messages, and the sudden influx of concern. The realization was heartbreaking, yet beautifully liberating. Because once you stop believing a lie, it completely loses its power over you. My phone vibrated again. Jennifer, still calling, still searching, still desperate. I stared at her name on the screen and silenced the phone. Not out of anger, but out of absolute clarity. For years, whenever my children needed me, I responded instantly, dropping everything to fix the problem, provide help, and make sacrifices. This time would be entirely different. This time, I was going to uncover the full truth before deciding what happened next. David's letter sat right beside me, the final line echoing in my mind. Trust yourself. You are far stronger than you realize. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I actually believed he might be right. Because the woman who had felt terrified outside Jennifer's house was gone. In her place was a woman who finally understood a crucial truth. The house was never theirs. The assets were never theirs. And my future was never theirs to control. And before this was over, everyone involved was going to learn that lesson. Myself included. The very first thing I did on Monday morning was call the bank. Not Jennifer, not Michael, not Brian, the bank. 3 days ago, the decision would have felt extreme. Now it felt absolutely mandatory. By then, I had spent nearly 48 hours reviewing documents with Robert and Daniel. It seemed like every passing hour exposed another unsettling truth. Nothing catastrophic or dramatic enough for a television crime show, just a steady accumulation of facts that painted a picture I could no longer ignore. My family had been planning around me instead of with me, and I was completely done being the last person to know about the arrangements for my own life. I sat in Robert's conference room while a representative from my primary bank joined us over the phone. The woman introduced herself politely, verified my identity, and asked how she could assist me. I glanced at Robert, who gave a brief nod. I'd like to do a full review of every single person who has authorization to access any of my accounts. The representative paused briefly. Of course, no problem at all. A few minutes later, she began listing the information. Most of it was expected. The checking account, the savings account, the investment links, and the automatic transfers. Then, she reached a section that made my stomach turn. We have a few authorized secondary access permissions listed here. I sat up straight. Secondary access permissions? Yes, ma'am. My eyes turned to Robert. Who is it? The representative began reading the names. The first was no surprise. David. An old authorized record kept on file. The second name caught me completely off guard. Michael Matthews. I closed my eyes slowly and carefully. Please explain exactly what that means. The representative explained. The permission wasn't ownership. It didn't grant full control, but it did allow visibility, and information retrieval, and access to specific financial details. It was enough to monitor the accounts, view the balances, and know far more than I ever realized. When was this established? The representative checked the records. Roughly 4 years ago. 4 years ago. I immediately flashed back to that time. David had been ill, and Michael had offered to help handle the paperwork. At the time, it felt completely harmless, even responsible. I never imagined it could ever turn into something else. "Remove it," I said. The representative didn't hesitate. "Done, no problem at all." A strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't retaliation or satisfaction. It was something far healthier, a sense of boundaries. Perhaps for the first time in years, I was establishing firm boundaries. Once the call ended, Robert smiled faintly. "How does that feel?" I thought about the question. Lighter. It was true. Every step felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. The next few hours followed a very similar pattern. Financial institutions, legal reviews, document updates, and authorization changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just practical decisions. Yet every single decision was vital because it sent the exact same message. My life belongs to me. By late afternoon, my phone rang again. "Jennifer." I stared at the screen and let it go straight to voicemail. A minute later, another call came through from Michael, then Brian. I ignored every single one. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I simply wasn't ready. The truth was, every time I saw their names, conflicting emotions surfaced. Love, anger, disappointment, and sadness. No mother simply stops loving her children at 68 years old. Even when they hurt her, even when they betray her, the love remains. That is exactly why betrayal hurts so deeply. It has a very deep place to land. My phone vibrated with a voicemail notification, then another, and another. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I listened to Jennifer's message first. "Mom, please call me back." Her voice sounded incredibly tight. "We need to talk." There it was again. Need, not want. Need. I switched to Michael's voicemail. "Mom, this situation is getting completely out of hand." An interesting choice of words. Not heartbreaking or emotional. It was an administrative tone, like a project facing complications. Then I listened to Brian's, and that one commanded my attention instantly. "Renee, there are some misunderstandings here that need to be cleared up." Misunderstandings. I nearly laughed out loud. A forged signature is not a misunderstanding. Secret meetings are not a misunderstanding. Conversations about assisted living are not a misunderstanding. They are choices. Conscious choices. And someone made them. Later that evening, Daniel called, and his voice carried an energy I hadn't heard before. "Are you sitting down?" I grew alert immediately. "What's going on?" "I found something." The sentence sent a chill right through me. "What?" "A clear trail of debt." I glanced at Robert, who was reviewing files across the room, and put the call on speakerphone. Daniel continued, "Brian's financial troubles are far worse than we initially thought." I wasn't surprised, but what came next shocked me. "There are commercial loans." "Yes." "Personal loans." "Yes." "And a second mortgage." I frowned. "On Jennifer's house?" "Yes." Silence fell over the room. A second mortgage. I had no idea, and clearly Jennifer hadn't mentioned it to me either. Daniel continued. "Several of these debts appear to be tied directly to failed investment ventures." The picture became painfully clear. Brian wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. And desperate people often convince themselves that unethical decisions are temporary, necessary, and justified. Until those decisions ruin everything. How does this connect to me? I already guessed the answer. Daniel confirmed it anyway. Your asset value would resolve the vast majority of their financial problems. There it was. The line nobody wanted to say out loud. My assets. Not me, my assets. The distinction was critical, because for the first time, I could clearly see the motivation driving everything. It wasn't care, it wasn't family planning, it was money. A painful sadness washed over me as I recalled all the Thanksgiving conversations, the whispers, the glances, and the hidden documents. Every single road seemed to lead straight back to money. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a few minutes. Finally, Robert spoke. "You're mourning." I looked up. "Mourning the illusion of your family." His words hit home with uncomfortable accuracy because that was exactly what I was doing. The facts were incredibly hurtful, but they were nothing compared to the collapse of belief. The belief that family always acts out of love. The belief that beneath every mistake lies good intentions. The belief that loyalty naturally follows sacrifice. Life simply isn't that straightforward. People are complicated, even the ones we love, especially the ones we love. As night fell, I made one final decision, perhaps the most important one yet. I called my insurance company, then my attorney, then several institutions linked to David's estate planning. One by one, I updated the records, verified the protective measures, added security barriers, and strengthened the fortress. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just prudent management. By the time I finished, any avenue for transferring assets without my direct involvement had effectively vanished. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt safe. Not physically safe, but financially, legally, and emotionally secure. My phone vibrated again, but this time it wasn't Jennifer, Michael, or Brian. It was Emma. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetie." "Grandma!" Her voice sounded intensely relieved. "Yes, I was hoping you'd answer." I smiled. "I'll always answer for you." After a brief pause, she shared something unexpected. "Mom and Dad are arguing." I exchanged a glance with Robert. "About what?" "I think it's money. Money again. Always money." Emma hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I heard Dad say, everything is completely ruined." I narrowed my eyes. Everything. Not Thanksgiving, not family relationships. Everything. A plan, a strategy, something far larger than I had initially imagined. Once the call ended, I found myself staring out the office window. The sun was setting, and the city lights were beginning to flicker. For the first time, I recognized a fundamental truth. Thanksgiving hadn't ruined my family, it had simply exposed it. The masks were slipping, and the lies were unraveling. Beneath all the excuses and manipulation, the true motives were finally visible. The question now was no longer whether a plot existed. The evidence had already answered that. The question was just how far they were willing to go, and whether they understood that I was no longer the woman they thought they could control. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I was missing. At least, that's what my family believed. The reality wasn't nearly as dramatic. I hadn't vanished into thin air. I had simply stopped being constantly available. For years, my life had been like an open door. Anyone could call, anyone could visit, and anyone could claim my time, my help, and my attention, and I always said yes. Now, that door was closed. Not locked forever, just closed long enough for me to breathe, long enough to think, and long enough to remember who I was before I became everyone else's solution. That was exactly why, on a cold December morning, I was driving north along a winding highway. My destination was nearly 3 hours away. A small cabin hidden by the lake. A place David had loved deeply, and a place most people had completely forgotten about. Myself included. Near noon, the cabin appeared through the trees, A modest building of weathered wood, a stone-turned chimney, and a wide front porch. It wasn't luxurious or flashy, yet, the moment I saw it, my chest tightened. Memories came rushing back. Weekend fishing trips, quiet mornings sharing coffee with David, long walks along the water, conversations about retirement, and dreams of growing old together. Dreams that were never fully realized. I parked the SUV and sat quietly for a few minutes. The lake glistened under a pale winter sky, and snow covered the shoreline. The entire place felt like a sanctuary untouched by chaos and untainted by betrayal, far away from everything waiting for me back in Ohio. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt a sensation close to pure peace. The inside of the cabin looked exactly as I remembered. David's fishing rods still hung in the corner. A few old photos rested on the shelves, and a stack of books sat by the fireplace. Inside one of the books, David's bookmark remained in place. I picked it up carefully. It was a hardware store receipt from 3 years ago. Somehow, that tiny detail nearly brought me to tears. That is exactly how grief works. Sometimes it isn't a massive event. Sometimes it's just a forgotten receipt, a coffee mug, a jacket hanging in the closet, or the simple evidence of a life lived. I spent the afternoon unpacking, building a fire in the hearth, making tea, and watching the snowdrift across the lake. For the first time in years, nobody needed me to do a single thing. Nobody expected anything from me. The silence felt strange at first, then deeply comforting, and finally, absolutely essential. That night, my phone vibrated continuously. Jennifer, Michael, Brian. The pattern carried on with calls, texts, and voicemails. I ignored every single one. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I simply wasn't ready to hear explanations. Explanations usually arrive only after people get caught. The truth arrives beforehand. There is a major difference between the two. Around 7 in the evening, another call came through. Emma. I answered right away. Hi, sweetie. Oh, thank goodness. Her relief was unmistakable. Are you okay? I've been so worried. Unlike the others, she sounded entirely genuine. No agenda, no hidden motives, just pure care. The kind of care family members are supposed to offer one another. I'm fine. Where are you? I smiled. A very peaceful place. She chuckled softly. That sounds wonderful. It really is. A pause followed, and then her voice dropped low. Things are really bad at home. Sat up straight. What do you mean? Everyone is constantly arguing. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. About what? Mostly about you. I stared at the fire in the hearth. Me? Dad keeps fighting with Mom. That caught my attention immediately. Brian and Jennifer, the center of the entire vortex. What are they fighting about? Emma hesitated before answering carefully. Money? There it was again. Always money. I felt a wave of sadness because every new discovery seemed to point directly back to the exact same place. Not concern, not love money. Emma continued. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I know. But I heard Dad shouting. My stomach tightened. What did he say? Another pause. Then he said everything was supposed to be finished by now. Finished. The word lingered in my mind. Finished. As if a process had been interrupted, a plan delayed. What else? He told her. You ruined everything. I closed my eyes and for several seconds, I couldn't say a single word. Not because the sentence was hurtful, but because it confirmed everything. A person only says, you ruined everything when they were anticipating a specific outcome. Something valuable and significant. And now it has fallen through. Emma's voice softened. I'm sorry, Grandma. None of this is your fault. I know, I said, though she didn't sound convinced. Like many children, she was carrying a burden that didn't belong to her. I shifted the topic, asking about her school, her artwork, her friends, ordinary things. For a few minutes, the conversation felt wonderfully normal. Then, she said something entirely unexpected. There's one more thing. The sudden gravity in her tone commanded my attention. What is it? I think you need to know. I leaned forward as the fire crackled softly beside me. Outside, the snow kept falling, and inside, my pulse quickened. What happened? Emma took a deep breath. Last week, before Thanksgiving, Mom and Dad had someone over to the house. I listened intently. Who? I don't know. Okay, they were talking in Dad's office. My heart quickened. The office, the exact same office where I had overheard the conversation on Thanksgiving night. The office that always seemed to hold the secrets. I didn't mean to listen, she apologized again, caught between loyalty and the truth. It's okay. I heard Uncle Michael's voice too. That grabbed my attention instantly. What were they discussing? Emma lowered her voice to a whisper. The house. I wasn't surprised, but I remained silent, letting her continue. They kept bringing up your name. And they said once all the papers were signed, things would be much easier. Signed. That word again. Signatures, paperwork, approvals. Everything circled back to the exact same origin. The forged signature, the property discussions, the desperation. Then, Emma said the words that changed everything. I recorded part of it. The entire room seemed to freeze in that exact moment. I thought I had misheard her. What? I recorded part of the conversation. I went completely rigid. You did? It was an accident. I was originally recording a video for a friend. She sounded incredibly nervous. I didn't know it mattered. The fire popped loudly in the hearth, and neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked, do you still have it? Yes. My mind raced. An actual recording, not hearsay, not speculation. A recording, actual evidence. Something concrete and real. I can send it to you. I didn't exchange a glance with anyone. I just stared fixedly at the fire. Because suddenly, the situation had completely shifted. Not emotionally, but strategically. Until now, most of what we uncovered had come through documents and investigations, useful and vital but circumstantial. A recording was something entirely different. It was a window straight into the truth, raw and unedited. Would you be willing to send it to me? Of course. I smiled bitterly. Thank you, sweetie. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. The lake outside had faded completely into the darkness, and the cabin remained warm and secure. Yet my thoughts were racing. Emma, the recording, the conversations, the house, the signature, the plan. Every single road seemed to be converging toward a single destination, the truth. For the first time, I began to realize that the evidence my family feared most might not be hidden in bank records, legal documents, or property deeds. It might be sitting right on a teenage girl's phone, waiting to reveal exactly what they said, when they believed absolutely nobody was listening. The video arrived the following morning. I stared at the notification on my phone screen for nearly a full minute before opening it. Not because I lacked the technical skill, but because I was terrified of what I would hear. Some truths are much easier to suspect than they are to confirm. The file wasn't long, less than 7 minutes. 7 minutes that would alter the way I viewed my family forever. I forwarded it to Robert immediately, then to Daniel. Within an hour, the three of us were sitting together in Robert's office. The video played on the laptop right in front of us, and nobody said a word. Finally, Robert pressed play. The footage was shaky, clearly recorded unintentionally at first. The camera was pointed directly at the floor, occasionally capturing glimpses of furniture. The audio echoed in from another room, the exact office Emma had described as Brian's. The recording began with casual chatter, background noise, and the sound of people moving around. Then, a familiar voice emerged. "Michael, we can't keep waiting forever." My stomach tightened. Brian answered immediately. "I know." We listened as the room fell into a dead silence. The conversation carried on without context or introduction, just people speaking completely freely because they believed nobody important was listening. Michael sounded deeply frustrated. "She's not going to volunteer." Volunteer, an interesting choice of words. Not agree, not choose. Volunteer. As if my cooperation were a logistical nuisance. Brian let out a sigh. "So we need an alternative route. An alternative route." The phrase made my skin crawl. Robert paused the video, and nobody spoke for a long moment before he resumed playback. Jennifer's voice joined the conversation. "I don't like this." For the first time in weeks, I felt a sudden wave of relief. Maybe Jennifer opposed this. Maybe she had tried to stop it. Maybe... The very next sentence completely shattered that hope. "I just didn't want her to find out." Not, "I don't want to do this." Not, "This is wrong." Not, "Stop." She wasn't against the plan. She was just against getting caught. A sharp pain pierced my chest. The video kept playing. Next came Brian's voice. "Once the paperwork is done, none of this matters anyway." The room fell into a heavy silence. Paperwork. Always paperwork. Always documents. Always signatures. Robert paused the recording again. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Neither man looked surprised. Just deeply disappointed. I understood why. This evidence wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was real. People talking honestly. People exposing who they truly were. The video resumed. A few seconds later, the line that changed everything came through the speakers. Michael gave a soft, casual laugh and said, "If we can just show she's confused, things will be a whole lot easier." Those words completely sucked the air right out of the room. Confused. In elder law and estate planning, that isn't just a word for being forgetful or vulnerable. Confused is a legal term. A strategic weapon, an incredibly dangerous label. I stared at the screen, unable to move, unable to blink, unable to fully process what I had just heard. Robert paused the video once more. The office was dead silent. Finally, I spoke up. "What does that mean?" His answer was immediate. "It means they were discussing your legal capacity." My heart sank to the bottom of my stomach. Legal capacity. Mental competence. The rights to make your own choices, to control your own property, to say no. Suddenly, everything made sense. The talk about assisted living, the secret meetings, the forged signature, the pressure, the urgency. They weren't just trying to influence me. They were discussing how to completely strip away my rights and my autonomy. Daniel leaned forward. "That phrasing is highly alarming." Highly alarming. That was the private investigator version of a red alert. Robert hit play again. The conversation grew even harder to stomach. Jennifer sounded anxious. "What if she refuses?" Brian shot back instantly. "Then we'll just have to accelerate the timeline." Accelerate the timeline, not reconsider, not stop, fast track it. The sheer confidence in his voice sent a shiver down my spine because it proved there was a plan, a strategy already in motion. This wasn't a sudden, impulsive discussion. It was a calculated operation. Then Michael's voice returned. Once we sell the house, most of the problems solve themselves. There it was. The house. The absolute center of everything. All these conversations seemed to revolve around it. An object deemed worthy of sacrificing a mother's trust. Manipulating family, lying, and betraying a woman who gave them everything. The video ended shortly after. There was no dramatic confession, no criminal mastermind speech, just ordinary people discussing deeply selfish things. And somehow, that made it hurt even worse. When the screen went black, nobody moved. For several minutes, the only sound was the faint hum of the laptop. Finally, Robert closed it. "All right," he said, a single word carrying immense weight. Daniel broke the silence first. "This changes the nature of the situation." I nodded slowly, because it absolutely did. Before this, most of what we uncovered could have been explained away as misunderstandings, poor judgment, or bad communication. Not anymore. This recording revealed intent. While it might not be a direct legal conviction yet, emotionally, it exposed everything. I sat quietly, trying to digest it all, trying to reconcile those voices with the children I loved. Because that was still the hardest part. I loved them. Even now. Even after everything. Love doesn't just vanish on command. If only it were that easy. Finally, Robert opened another folder. What's next? I looked up. The question hung heavily between us. What's next? A month ago, my answer would have been completely different. I would have avoided conflict, protected their feelings, made excuses, and accepted their explanations. Not now. I thought about Thanksgiving, the folding table, my invisible arrival, the conversations that stopped the second I walked in, the fake concern, the hidden documents, the video, David's letter. All of it. Then I made my decision. I want to see them. Both men looked surprised. Robert asked, "Are you sure? You don't have to rush into this." "I'm not rushing. I've made up my mind." The decision felt calm, certain, and necessary. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth. There's a difference. Daniel leaned back. "If we do this, it should happen right here." I nodded. Agreed. Neutral ground, a professional environment, with witnesses present. No shouting matches in someone's kitchen. No emotional manipulation. No guilt trips. Just the facts. Robert opened his calendar. "We can arrange that." For the next hour, we discussed logistics, dates, documents, evidence, legal protections, and practical matters. Yet beneath it all lay a stark reality. Soon, I would be sitting directly across from my children, looking into their eyes, and listening to whatever explanation they chose to offer. A part of me dreaded that moment. Another part craved it, because the uncertainty was agonizing. At least the truth allows you to move forward. At the very end of the meeting, Robert handed me a document. I recognized it immediately, an amendment to my estate planning, my trust, and my beneficiaries. I looked up. "Is this an option?" I read through the pages carefully. Everything suddenly felt very real. For years, I had assumed my estate would automatically pass down to my children. Now I understood a vital truth. Inheritance isn't an entitlement. It's built on trust, and trust can be broken. Robert spoke gently.